Right now, in your pocket, there is a device that carries his voice, and you have almost certainly never heard his name. Antonio Muxay built a working voice transmission device in 1854. He filed legal paperwork protecting his claim in 1871. And when the time came to renew that protection in 1874, the fee was $10. He didn't have it. That single, brutal fact, $10, handed the most valuable patent in American history to someone else. Muxay died in 1889, poor and forgotten. Alexander Graham Bell died in 1922, one of the most celebrated men in the world. The telephone had made Bell a monument, and for over a century, that monument stood unchallenged. This is the story of what actually happened. Antonio Santi Giuseppe Muxay was born in Florence in 1808, the son of a government worker. He studied mechanical and chemical engineering at the Academy of Fine Arts, not a hobbyist, not a dreamer, but a formally trained technician with a precise, disciplined mind. By his late 20s, he was working as a stage technician at the Teatro della Pergola, one of Florence's most celebrated opera houses, rigging the acoustic systems that carried voices across vast, gilded rooms. He understood sound as a physical thing, not an abstraction. He understood how it moved through air, through wood, through wire and membrane. He thought about it the way a surgeon thinks about the body, as a system that could be mapped, manipulated, improved. In 1835, political pressures in Florence made his position untenable. He had been imprisoned briefly for his associations with nationalist movements, and he eventually made his way to Havana, Cuba, where he spent over a decade working as a technical director at a theater. It was there, sometime around 1849, that he stumbled into the idea that would define and ultimately destroy his life. He was experimenting with electromedical treatments, a fashionable practice at the time, running mild electrical currents through patients to treat various ailments. One day, a patient some distance away held a copper wire to his mouth while Muxay pressed the other end against his ear. He heard a sound, not noise, not static, a sound that carried the shape of a human voice. The electric current had transmitted something. He felt it before he understood it. He wrote about this moment in his own words. He was astonished. That's an understatement from a man who spent the next 2 decades of his life in relentless, exhausting, often financially ruinous pursuit of that sensation. By 1850, Muxay and his wife Esther had moved to Staten Island, New York, settling in a modest house in the working-class neighborhood of Clifton. Esther was severely ill with rheumatoid arthritis, bedridden, unable to move through the house freely, and Muxay's first practical application of his voice transmission device was heartbreakingly domestic. He strung wire between his basement workshop and their upstairs bedroom so that Esther could call for him without shouting. The telephone was invented, in its first real form, so a husband could hear his sick wife's voice from the next floor. Over the following years, he built at least 30 distinct models of what he called the teletrafono. These were not sketches or theories. They were physical devices, copper wire, membranes made of animal intestine or parchment, metal diaphragms, electromagnetic coils. He demonstrated them publicly. He demonstrated them to Italian-language newspapers in New York. He demonstrated them to associates, neighbors, and businessmen who might fund him. The devices worked. Voices traveled through wire. This was the 1850s and early 1860s. The Civil War was still being fought when Muxay was already transmitting speech electronically across meaningful distances. What he lacked, catastrophically and consistently, was money. His financial life was a slow collapse. He had invested savings into an ill-fated scheme involving a tallow candle factory on Staten Island. The enterprise failed. Esther's medical costs were relentless. He worked whatever jobs he could find. He was badly burned in a boiler explosion aboard the Staten Island ferry in 1871, which left him hospitalized for months and drained what little remained of their finances. The sketches he had prepared for his invention, the detailed technical models he had built over 20 years, had to be sold. He sold them to fund their survival. Some were later reported to have vanished entirely from the offices of a company he'd given them to, but we'll come to that. In 1871, with whatever money he could gather, Muxay filed a caveat with the U.S. Patent Office. A caveat was not a full patent. It was a formal legal notice, a documented declaration that an inventor was working toward a patent on a specific device and that anyone filing a similar patent should be notified so the caveat holder could contest it. The language in Muxai's caveat was clear and specific. It described the electrical transmission of the human voice. Filed December 28, 1871, documented, official. A caveat had to be renewed annually. The fee was $10. In 1874, Antonio Muxai could not pay it. The caveat lapsed. His legal protection evaporated. The window through which he might have secured his place in history closed and locked. Now consider the timing. Alexander Graham Bell filed his patent for the telephone on February 14, 1876, 2 years after Muxai's caveat lapsed. Bell's patent, number 174,465, is one of the most financially valuable documents in American legal history. Within years, the Bell Telephone Company would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. By the turn of the century, it would control an empire. But here is where the story stops being a tragedy of poverty and becomes something harder to look at. Muxai had not simply filed paperwork and walked away. He had, in 1871, also sent a package of working models and technical documents to the American District Telegraph Company of New York, hoping to interest them in his device. The vice president of that company later became associated with Western Union Telegraph, and Western Union was the corporate partner in Alexander Graham Bell's earliest telephone ventures. The specific models and documents Muxai sent were, according to Muxai's own later testimony, never returned to him despite repeated requests. When he asked for them back, he was told they had been lost. There is also this. Alexander Graham Bell conducted experiments at the laboratory of Charles Williams, Jr. in Boston. The custodian of that laboratory, who controlled access to equipment, documents, and storage, was a man named Thomas A. Watson, Bell's own assistant. What passed through the hands of whom, when, and with whose awareness is a question that courts would eventually grapple with. What is documented is that Bell's patent was filed on the same day, February 14, 1876, as a competing application from Elisha Gray, another independent inventor working on voice transmission. The U.S. Patent Office's handling of those two applications was itself the subject of congressional investigation and persistent allegations of corruption. Bell's application was processed first. Gray's was not. Bell won the patent. Muxai sued. With almost no money, with documents he claimed had vanished, with the English language still a barrier, he had never mastered it fluently, he pursued legal action through the 1880s. The case reached a point where the U.S. Attorney General's office became involved, and a federal lawsuit was initiated on the government's behalf, not because of sentiment, but because the evidence of prior invention was considered legally substantive. Then, in 1889, Antonio Muxai died. The government's case died with him. Bell's patent had already expired by then anyway, having run its full legal term. The commercial question was settled. The historical one was buried. Bell went on to extraordinary things. He co-founded what became AT&T. He was feted, photographed, given honorary degrees. His name was placed on elementary schools. Statues were raised. The unit of sound intensity, the decibel, is named in his honor. He is the telephone in the public imagination as completely as Edison is the light bulb or Ford is the automobile. Esther Muxai outlived her husband. She died in a poorhouse. Let that sit for a moment. The woman for whom the telephone was first built, the woman whose voice traveled through that wire from the bedroom above the workshop, died in a poorhouse. Antonio Muxai was buried in Staten Island. His grave received a modest headstone. The neighborhood of Clifton, where he had lived and worked and built his 30 models, went about its business. The story of the man who first transmitted speech electrically remained, for most of the next century, a footnote mentioned primarily in Italian-language historical journals and the occasional academic paper. The rehabilitation came slowly, and for those who knew the history, with a particular bitterness about how long it had taken. In the 1990s, historians and researchers, including Italian-American advocacy organizations who had long argued for Muxai's recognition, began pushing the case more loudly into public discourse. The documented evidence was re-examined. The 1871 caveat, the contemporary newspaper accounts of his demonstrations, his own detailed technical descriptions, the testimony from his lawsuits, the circumstantial questions about the missing models. On June 11, 2002, the United States House of Representatives passed House Resolution 269. The resolution formally honored Antonio Muxay and stated, in the language of official legislative record, that his work in the invention of the telephone should be acknowledged. Representative Vito Fossella of New York, who introduced the resolution, said plainly, if Muxay had been able to pay the $10 fee to maintain his caveat, Bell would never have been able to file his patent. 113 years after Muxay's death. That is how long it took for the United States government to say, officially, that the wrong man's name had been on the invention. Canada, for its part, had passed a similar motion in 2002, though it was non-binding. Canada, where Bell had actually lived and worked, where his estate at Baddeck, Nova Scotia, is now a National Historic Site. The irony is architectural. The resolution did not rename anything. It did not remove Bell's name from the history books or the textbooks or the buildings. It was an acknowledgement, not a correction. The patent profits, the corporate empire, the cultural legacy, those remained exactly where they had always been. What this story actually demonstrates is not simply that one man was robbed by another. The individual actors here operated within systems, patent systems, corporate systems, immigration systems, that were structurally hostile to people without capital. The caveat system required annual fees that were modest by middle-class standards and insurmountable by the standards of a man with a sick wife and no savings. The patent system rewarded the person who could afford to file a complete application over the person who could only afford to signal intention. Western Union and the Bell interests had lawyers. They had offices. They had the infrastructure of American commercial power in the Gilded Age. Muxay had models built from animal intestine and copper wire and 20 years of obsessive, brilliant work. The lesson is not that Bell was necessarily a villain in the cartoonish sense. History is rarely that clean. The lesson is that systems of intellectual property protection, as they existed and arguably still exist, are not neutral. They favor the capitalized over the capable. They favor the English-speaking, the well-connected, and the legally represented over the isolated, the immigrant, and the poor. Antonio Muxay was all of the latter, and the system processed him accordingly. The other lesson is about what we choose to commemorate. Statues are decisions. What gets named, what gets taught, what image appears in the mind when someone says, the telephone. These are not accidents of history. They are the accumulated weight of a century of choices about whose story gets told and whose gets quietly filed away. Bell's face is everywhere. Muxay's face appears, if you look carefully, on a small mural in Staten Island and in the collections of the Garibaldi Muxay Museum, which operates out of the very house where he lived and worked and first strung wire between the basement and the bedroom. You can visit it. Not many people do. His name was Antonio Muxay. He was a formally trained engineer and acoustics technician from Florence who spent 20 years and everything he owned building a device that now exists in 8 billion human pockets. He built the first version of it so his wife could call for him when she was in pain. He filed the paperwork to protect it. He couldn't pay $10. The most important patent in American history slipped through a hole that size. Congress acknowledged the truth in 2002. History kept moving. Bell's statue still stands. And the next time someone uses the word telephone, which traces its Greek roots to tele, meaning far, and phone, meaning voice. The voice that first traveled that wire belonged to a man named Muxay, calling down from the upstairs room to hear if anyone was listening. Someone was, just not the ones who got the credit.